Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar titled Maximizing the Benefits of a Unified Clinical Data Capture and Management Platform, presented by Medidata, a Dassault Systems company. I'm Vanessa Platt. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Medidata, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Alethea Weiland, President, Chief Operating Officer, and Founder of Clinical Research Strategies. We're also joined today by Aaron O'Boyle, who's the Head of Clinical Operations at Resolute, as well as Katrina Rice, Executive Vice President of Professional Services at eClinical Solutions. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we go ahead and begin. If you'd like to download the slide deck, you can click on the Handouts tab button on the left side of your screen. This webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, just make sure that your volume is turned up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab located on the left side of your screen. So we're going to get started today's webinar with a poll question. How has COVID-19 most impacted your clinical trials? You may select all that apply. The responses available are the need for e-consent requirements, the increase in poll amendments, protocol amendments, additional data collected from disparate data sources, need for capabilities to support drug device shipments, as in direct-to-patient or virtual trials, or an increase in the use of electronic data collection tools or patient handheld devices. And if there's also another category, you may use that as well. We'll keep the poll open for about another 15 seconds. Looks like we're getting some really nice responses in here. So if you haven't submitted yet, you still have about 10 seconds remaining. Great. Let's then move over and take a look at the results. So what's interesting here is we actually have, it looks like a fairly nice split between the results here. And I think what this is really showing us is that the impact of COVID-19 is really having various effects across clinical trials. What I'd like to do is, keeping in mind your responses here and kind of moving this into the discussion with each one of our panelists, is really kind of a nice segue into looking at what the key trends across the industry are today, and keeping in mind the impact of COVID-19 on those specific trends. We're going to start off today with Alethea Weiland. Alethea, could you please share with us today some of the key trends across the industry that you're seeing?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Vanessa. Obviously, the 21st Century Cures Act has set the stage for where we are today in research. COVID-19 has certainly just been a watershed moment and shown us the unnecessary bottlenecks and obstacles to data monitoring. We are now looking at the necessary shifts to do risk-based monitoring, remote visits, the whole notion of decentralization, hybrid trials, virtual trials, etc. Another important thing is that the regulators have begun to embrace this transformational, innovative method approach for data reliability and data capture, so long as that it is Part 11 compliant. I know, for instance, the FDA has released numerous guidances in this area, and we're also seeing the increase of digital therapeutics with a variety of endpoints, the use of mobile apps, telemedicine, etc. You know, we can do things that are far more patient-centric than ever before. And then finally, I'm seeing amongst my peers and in the industry itself is an entire critique on what is the essential data to answer the real research questions on safety and efficacy.
Alethea, thank you for that. Erin, why don't we go ahead and move over to you?
Yeah, I was going to add on to that, Alethea, and that I've been noticing as well is just looking at things that we kind of ability beforehand, but we're now looking as more of a reality and implementing right away. One of which being mobile health and implementing the collection of local labs into our database, as well as bringing in more of a robust ePro clinical options to get from the patients while they're not in on site and at home. So I do see a definitely evolving shift, moving more into, you know, things that were always there, but we never really took the time to consider. I think we're definitely moving more into, you know, a collection of getting data remotely, you know, as best as we can right now.
Great, Erin. Thank you for that. And you know, I definitely think it's important, kind of as we think about the impacts that are there as well. When we think about the patient centricity, you know, aspect of it, Katrina, I'd like to turn it over to you for any impacts as well.
Yeah, so thank you guys for that. One of the biggest things that I think is becoming more reality too is the need to manage all that data. So now we have all these different modes and different streams of how data is coming in is becoming even more important for all that data to be managed in some type of centralized manner and using technologies that people still feel comfortable with the validity of the data that's coming in. So I think the need for data collection and all these different modes is actually also making it become very obvious that it needs to be technologies that you can manage all this data streams that are coming in, which also gives different key stakeholders the ability to look at the data in different ways as well. So I think it's with the trends of moving toward collecting data in so many different fashions is also the bigger need to make sure that you can consolidate and manage that data as well.
Yeah, I definitely would agree that, you know, as we are working in this industry, that many of us are experiencing at some time or another, you know, various degrees of different types of realities. And I think, you know, most of what we're seeing and most of what we're hearing are really kind of focused around the inefficiencies. You know, what are some of those key drivers as we're looking at, you know, either the current planning of our trials or certainly the future outlook of how we go about with our planning. And lastly, around the increased complexity across clinical trials as well. I'd like to move on to some considerations around the face of regulators and the impact on trial conduct and data capture. Katrina, you gave us a really nice segue into that. Erin, let's start off with you, and I'd like for you to share with us your perspective on how you see the face of regulators amidst, you know, both U.S. regulations as well as global regulations and the impacts that you're seeing there.
Yeah, a lot of the impacts that we're running into actually right now, just in our studies being all over the world, is the issues of getting our labs to our central depots in time for safety analyses. And so what I would really like to implement and bring into subsequent and future studies is the implementation of local labs, running local labs, safety standard labs, you know, at the site where we need versus, you know, taking the risk and sending it to the central lab and potentially losing samples while they're in transit. It's really unfortunate when you work so hard and the patients are giving all this time that we can't run their samples and that they're not making it. So I would like to see the implementation upfront as an alternative of sites being able to use local labs when they need, and also, you know, allowing, you know, them to use mobile health and ePro devices as much as possible where you can in order to reduce the on-site visits as well. So really having, you know, more of a unified platform to collect all this data, whether you're on-site or whether it's sent to a central location.
Katrina, let's jump over to you.
Yes. So one of the things I definitely agree with the need to look at how we can maximize and use local labs much more in clinical research. I think it because some of the challenges with that is making sure that we can, get the not just the result data, but the ranges, the normal ranges, and how you kind of manage that data as well. So I think those are being able to look at different ways to maximize what we have at our hand as opposed to so many, like distribution of hands off. I think it's going to be some of the critical areas for us to be looking and facing. And as we have been using local labs and managing studies, we'll have local lab data for a long time now. I think it's becoming more important that we really need to have more of a standard and structured way to actually do that, so that as was noted, we won't lose out on any data or be bottlenecked by the front end. Sometimes the shipping and receiving of samples is going to, get difficult, especially as we're in this COVID time. Just with the overall shipping of samples is even more complex. So I definitely agree with that need to look at how we can utilize things that are at the site's access, or even for that particular example, even for our patients, because as you move in more patient trials, and there, you're not really moving away from maybe having so much data collected at the clinical site. We'll need to be able to manage that. Patients could be going to labs near their homes and all that. So we also need to be able to maximize and use that data as well.
Yeah, that's Katrina, that's a great point. I think really aligned with Erin's thoughts as well in terms of collecting data. We know that the volumes of the data are becoming just quite larger in light of different, protocol requirements and specifications. Alethea, I'd be interested to hear your insight as well as we think about the face of the regulators and the impact that it's having on the data capture and management.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that Erin and Katrina have said. Two things that have always entered my mind in the last few years is the notion of the deployment of real-world evidence and real-world data. We have enormous data sets that have been growing for decades that belong to the pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, and then folks like the Medidatas of the world, right? And so how can we actually deploy those data in more meaningful ways so that we're reducing the cost of clinical trials as a whole, and really going to clinic when we're absolutely sure a drug or a device is ready to go. So I'm seeing a lot more acceptance of real world evidence and real world data. That's not to say that those replace the traditional RCTs. And then secondarily, there's tons of medical devices out there that have been streaming really essential data over time. And again, a real cache of data sets that we can kind of simulate in silico trials before we test them in clinic. So the regulators have been talking about these methods for the last few years. I see an uptake in the interest, and I think this is a growing trend that we can take a look at over the next decade.
Great. Alethea, thank you so much for weighing in there. I think it's really clear here that the face of the regulations, whether it be from global perspectives or U.S. perspectives, there are a lot of shared similarities in terms of what that outlook looks like and what those requirements are, as well as, differences as well. And as we start to navigate through what some of those changes are going to look like, obviously keeping in mind, how disparate data sources play into that, how data is being managed in either small or large volumes, is certainly something, at front, right, that we need to certainly consider, and how the use of technology will certainly play an impact on that. So with that being said, I'd like to take us into another poll question for the audience. Amidst some of the concerns around COVID-19 and certainly what you are seeing across your clinical trials, how do you see the pandemic affecting technology needs? We've provided here a couple ideas or solutions for you. And again, you can select all that apply. But the ideas here are around multiple data source collection, diaries, handling missing data, AE, SAE reporting. And in case that there's something else that you may be seeing that differs from some of the ideas here, you can certainly indicate that as well. So we'll give this about another 15 seconds. Great, we're getting some really good responses here. Okay, looks like we have a majority of responses in. So according to our poll collection here, it looks like we've got about a fairly equal split between the handling of missing data as well as the multiple data source collection in terms of how we see the pandemic affecting technology needs. I think what's really interesting here, and we'll hear from our panelists when we get to them, is to really look at not only how the pandemic is affecting the technology needs, but then certainly looking at the approach for collecting data as well, whether it be within a primary system or in ancillary sources that may be required per protocol requirements or specifications outside of a primary system. So with that being said, I'd like to move us on to our next topic area here. And this is really centered around that approach for capturing data outside of the clinical trial site. Katrina, I'd like to start with you and kind of keeping in mind here, some of the ideas that we've heard around regulations. In your experience, what do you find to be requested or recommended approaches for capturing data outside of the clinical trial site? And bearing in mind any concerns around the patient centricity, provisioning devices, BYOD, what have you.
Yes. So from what we're seeing is we're definitely seeing more of an uptake on your eClo and your ePro, eConsent and ePro for collection mode. So we're definitely seeing an increase in that, as well as different types of sensors and mechanisms that patients are needing to capture. I think that definitely with the pandemic is making us realize and look at what data do we actually need to be collecting, and then what's the best mode of getting that data. So I think some of that is based on where we are, and I think definitely the need of what we're seeing, the evolution. But we're definitely seeing the uptake in ePro and eConsent, where more of that data we can actually put that at the hands of the patient. In addition, I think it's pushing us to look at, are we collecting the right data? And what modes are we using to collect that data? And realizing, I think with the point of so much missing data, is that really data that was even needed or relevant at that point as well? So that those are some of the things I would think of that we're seeing, and I think about when we talk about where we are and where we're going with clinical research.
Yeah, those are some really great points. And I think regardless of the roles that we are playing, right, across the industry, whether it's, clinical operations or data management, we're probably all just shaking our head to that. So I think that that's a great point there. Erin, I'd like to move it over to you. I'm sorry, Alethea, I'll move it over to you in terms of your considerations on this.
Absolutely. So obviously the rise of telemedicine has been illuminated during COVID-19. We're seeing a lot more of that interface. I've also noticed and have advised several bot companies that have developed these really interesting bots that actually engage with the patient more in real time to simulate certain visits. And I think that's really important, especially with the younger generation of patients participating in clinical trials now, that more immediate communication style, if you will, that doesn't necessarily involve a phone call or, an expense from the sponsor side to have to pay a coordinator to pay for that visit. And then finally, the whole idea of interoperability between EHR and EDC systems, I am seeing an uptake in that as well.
Great. Alethea, thank you for that. Erin, I'd like to move over to you for some of your considerations around the approach for capturing data outside of that trial site.
Yes, thanks. I agree with everything that, both Althea and Katrina have said. And I think when you're looking at a study, it's not every study has the right answer, and there's different approaches to take. But when you're thinking about provisioning devices or using a BYOD, there's a lot of things you have to consider. Some of the things that we've considered, I'm recently in the, provisioning the devices versus BYOD. And I can provide some reasons why we did that. I mean, one was we had an open label study, so there was a real potential for patients to share their data with other family and friends, and thus we wanted to tighten the controls of the data. And so we wanted to provision the devices. It also being a global study in a lot of remote areas of the world, we had to have the best Wi-Fi access. And some people, as we know, have older devices or no devices at all. So provisioning devices really allowed us to facilitate and accommodate all sites in all countries. And it also allowed the study coordinators and the study teams to focus on one set of instructions versus having so many different, phones or devices that could be used. It really allowed us to facilitate and, increase the translation time and, getting these devices to the sites in the language that they needed as well. I mean, we were able to offer about 3 or 4 languages to certain sites, and we were able to do all that just through provisioning the devices and putting that all in. And then we were also able to bring the devices to the investigator meetings and allow the sites to really demo it. So, I think you got to take an overall look at it and see where are you going, what type of patients are you going to be seeing, what's the Wi-Fi access, and ease of use for not only just the patient, but also the study team and everyone that's going to be looking at the data and reviewing the data. So I've really been on the most recently provisioning the devices, and it's allowed for the integration into the EDC much easier than my past when I've done the BYOD.
Great, Erin, I really appreciate that, and to Katrina and Alethea as well. It really sounds like the benefits to having our systems or your systems kind of working on some sort of a unified interface by which they can work together helps to really streamline, not only the efficiencies, the operational efficiencies to the sites, but certainly to the end users as well from a data collection and a data management perspective. Is there anything else kind of from that approach that anyone would like to weigh in on? Okay, so I think what we'll do then is we're going to move on to our next question, and really kind of looking around the specific areas to where the continued focus to improve the processes and the technology are needed. So Alethea, I'd like to go ahead and start with you on this particular topic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think there's, a huge disconnect between regulations, for instance, ICH GCP E6 Rev 2, and knowing that Rev 3 will be released here in the next few years. And on the device side, the ISO standards 14155, and really kind of doing that whole, the quality risk-based approach is where we're absolutely going, and what is the necessary evil behind making sure these data systems do have validation and appropriate data integrity, et cetera. I just would like to say, it's great for regulators to be releasing new guidances and new methodology, but those of us who have to conform with the regulations oftentimes see the actual regulations being a barrier. And so, having a Medidata, system with CTMS and EDC systems and risk-based monitoring tools, et cetera, it's only as good as the people who are setting these things up. And so I think what I'd like to see is better training across the industry, especially toward data science. And I think that's going to reflect well on the adjacent regulatory science that is also taking place.
Yeah, Alethea, that's an excellent point that you're bringing up, and certainly I think an area that we can all agree would definitely benefit from additional improvements. Erin, I'd like to move over to you as well in terms of sharing your perspective on where the continued focus to improve processes and technology are needed.
Yes, thanks. No, and I think I can probably, build upon what we were talking, in the last thing, and as well as making things better and more streamlined, because I couldn't agree with Althea more when she says it starts up, up front and when you're building. But, my main area of focus in starting a new program and a new time this year before COVID was really to bring in less integration. I really think there needs to be a lot more continued focus by companies to not have so many systems integrating with one another, and different EDCs, different ePros, different RTSMs. It just really makes things very complex when there are protocol amendments, which we know we have, and you have to update each system. But then after you update each system, then you also have to do an integration, and oftentimes those integrations don't work, and you have to implement patches. When you have more, I've just gone through an amendment change, so that's where I've seen where a uniform platform can help. When you do have a uniform system with with certain systems talking to each other that are affected by an amendment, ePro, EDC, RTSM, it really helps the implementation of that amendment to move much quicker when you have a uniform platform where everything's somewhat interconnected and related. At least that's just been my experience. And so I would like to see more attention and focus on reducing the amount of systems that are brought into one particular study. And I would also love to see, bringing in lab shipments from the time they leave the site to the time they arrive at, the depot. You can track that shipment and therefore give the depot, a heads up. The shipment's there. Don't let it sit for 3 days. That's just the one thing I would really love to see brought into the EDC that can be tracked from either the site or the study personnel.
Great, Erin. Thank you for that. It's a great perspective. Katrina, let's move over to you.
Yes. So one thing that I would want to is put a little bit of a different spin and thought to that. So one of the things I think we're just generally known for within this industry and within individual companies is jumping to picking your technologies. And a lot of times you're going with best of breeds, or and that's when you get into you having multiple different technologies within even a company. So I think in order to actually look at and standardize this, I think the first step is for companies to really think about your data strategy. Think about how you want your data to flow from the start through the end. And when I take start, I want to say not starting at when you have a protocol, but also starting at when you're ready to create the protocol. So really thinking about to improve your processes, limit your technologies, look at using uniform platform is to really think about putting together a data strategy within your organization. I know a lot of people get concerned when you think about a data strategy because people think large, they think it's a lot of work, think it's a lot of resources, but even within a smaller company, you could actually think about your strategy being, instead of going top down in your organization, thinking about that strategy even on a trial perspective and maybe putting together how you want that data flow, to be managed, what systems you want to use, looking at integrated technologies and platforms, even within the trial. And as that works well, then that bubbles up. So a lot of time people think about strategies are these large efforts that you need to put together, and only bigger companies can do that. I like to also think about, to really improve these areas when it comes to your processes and your technologies, is first to think about the strategy first. And then once you have that strategy, make sure you're picking the right technologies that can support your strategy. And then once you have those technologies, that's when you put in the processes. And those processes would you want to make sure that you can train and they're scalable, for not training just internal to your company. Make sure your processes are clean and clear with any service providers you may use, or even with the sites. So when I think about this area, I always think that people really get caught up. They pick technologies first. They fall in love with these bells and whistles, and then they miss the piece to whether those systems will actually support you through the life of your of your company, or will it support you based on where you are? So if we think about what we're facing now during the pandemic, if we think about the technologies and that we're using, are those really supporting us? Are they giving us what we need? We probably can answer the question, they're probably not. So maybe this is an opportunity to really thinking about a strategy first. And again, doesn't have to be big bang. It doesn't have to be, you can actually start with those strategies at the company level and then plug your processes and technologies once you've determined that.
Yeah, Katrina, I definitely agree with you. And I think that that's a good point to really think about too, is the stakeholders that are involved in that decision-making process, right? So when you start to think about identifying the strategy first and kind of building upon, once you have the strategy, what does it look like in terms of playing out your technology platforms, your processes that are involved in that. And when we start to think about the stakeholders, certainly it kind of brings us in mind in terms of that cross-functional, opportunities of working together, bringing in the relevant, expertise in order to drive those decisions. So I definitely think that that's a very valid point, and a great point from your perspective that you're bringing into it. I'd like to move us on to our final poll question for today's webinar, and kind of thinking about what you've just heard from each of our three panelists, and again, across your experiences, how are you seeing roles evolve over time as a result of these different changes? Again, you can select all that apply. There is an other option here for you. And your choices are more data-driven, greater global complexity, more cross-functional responsibilities, greater operational insight, as well as an increased use of more technology. So we'll go ahead and give it a few seconds here for you to log in your responses. Great. We're going to give it about 5 more seconds. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Wow. So it looks like here about 67 versus 78% are seeing roles really evolving over time as a result of more data-driven approaches, as well as an increased use of more technology. It looks like some more cross-functional responsibilities kind of also weighing in there as a higher priority, followed by the greater global complexity, as well as greater operational oversight. So again, I think what this is kind of really showing us is a little bit of a hybrid in terms of roles evolving, certainly taking into account how clinical trials are becoming more adept, becoming more complex, and certainly then the organizational structures as well. But I think it's important for us to kind of see how these different poll responses can differ, really, and what that kind of looks like in terms of the entire landscape of our clinical trial ecosystem. So I'd like to move on then to our next discussion, and that's really around how are we seeing the roles change as a result of that evolving ecosystem of clinical trials. Erin, let's go ahead and get started with you.
Yes, no, thanks. I think I think first and foremost, which I'm really excited about, is that there's been a lot more attention on patient-centric focus studies, meaning that we're getting rid of the collection of data or free text that we're asking the patients to collect that we don't necessarily have a means to do anything with, and it's not really applicable to the study. So I think bringing in the use of ePro diaries has really helped reduce the amount of noise in the data, if that's the way I could say it, and that we're really asking questions that are more specific questions and related to the treatment that's being done with the patient. And it also leads in the end to more meaningful table listings and graphs and will support the protocol analyses. So I see a lot of improvement with patient centricity. And then I'm also seeing a lot of improvement, I think, with sponsors having a little bit more better control and visibility into the IP and the release of IP, particularly with small studies that are just getting started and you're in various countries. You're allowed to really have much more control over the IP and not have as much waste going when you can visibly see everything that's happening live at the sites and ship in real time. So I see a lot of improvement as far as the studies and the use of these systems over time and how they've helped not only the patients and the sites, but also the sponsors and those looking at the data.
Yeah, I would agree. Katrina, let's move over to you and how you're seeing the roles change as a result of this evolving ecosystem of trials.
Yes, thank you. So definitely seeing that as an evolution of many of the roles in this industry. I can start in particular with the data managers. So as we noted in the poll question, just the sheer volume of data is much higher than we've ever seen it. In addition, the complexity of that data and the complexity of the trials, to me, is really driving that data managers, if we just even look at that role, is really need to be actually much more, I would say, technology smart, technology savvy. I think their need is to be more about understanding the key outcome and efficacy of the data and what the trial's intent and much more than ever before, and actually move away from the thought that their focus is just, I like to think about just query management, relying on a system to just program your edit checks. So I think the evolution of that role is where data managers really are required to be, I think, have more data science criteria. I think their understanding of technologies actually need to be there. I also think you're going to see an evolution and merging of the roles between a traditional clinical, a CRA, and a data manager. Because as we move that we're not able to, the method of reviewing data by only being on site is just not reality, especially if we look at that majority of our data is not even coming from traditional methods such as the sites. I think you're going to see the evolution of those roles that really they both are going to need to be looking at data and more of a risk approach. So we always talk about risk-based monitoring, which is just how you're going to monitor data and what you're going to focus on. I think you're going to see that data managers need to focus their review more on a risk perspective as well. So I think the evolution of pretty much all roles in this industry are just changes by nature of the complexity of the trials. We're using more technologies. So we're going to need to make sure that we have technical people that understand how technologies talk together and maximize the abilities to bring data together. So I think it's an evolution of almost all the roles, but I think the most glaring ones from what I'm seeing is between the data manager and how that transition of their role with a monitor is becoming more realistic than we've ever seen. And I suspect that we're going to see a lot more probably merging where you're not going to see a separation of maybe a data manager and a monitor. You'll probably see somebody more at a data science looking at data, again, more from a risk perspective, not just from a monitoring, but from a data review as well.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Alethea, let's move over to you.
Absolutely agree with what Katrina and Aaron have said. Definitely a merging of the CRA blended in like a hybrid with data science. They're really, what COVID-19 is teaching us is why the heck are we sending CRA monitors to a physical site to monitor data when we've actually had the necessary tools to do it all along virtually and remotely for the most part. There are some study designs that lend itself to having to go to the site, for instance, a phase 1 oncology study. But the bottom line is that, we've got the necessary tools to do this. And to Katrina's point, definitely seeing a merging of the traditional CRA role with the data scientist and a blending of those, so to speak. I also see sort of a blending of the data scientist with maybe a software engineer, right? Because these are the folks that are oftentimes programming application programming interfaces. They're making sure that those data handshakes between disparate systems are taking place. And I feel like that's going to be kind of that new novel, role that we're going to see, as well as the improvement and increasing of regulatory science. Regulatory science is so necessary to ensure that clinical trials are being run per the regulations and the guidances. We cannot forget ISO 14155, and we cannot forget ICH GCP and the necessary quality and regulatory and risk things that Katrina just alluded to.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Great. So with that being said, what do you feel that the industry should sustain going forward, and how does technology play a role in that? Katrina, let's start with you.
Yes, so I absolutely think that it's going to be important that, again, if we go back to my point about thinking about a data strategy and thinking about how you're going to manage and flow data across the board, I think it's going to be important for, again, the selection of the technologies that will be able to grow and scale with that as well. So I think it's going to be imperative for the technologists to be able to one, I think having technologies that are unified. So having where you can reduce the number of systems that you potentially need, but actually have, if you want to say, one platform that has the different mechanisms and features that you're going to need, I think is going to be really important. I think it's going to be important for technologies to make sure that their systems are compliant. And we have to remember to continue to focus on, because we're going to have this different streams of data, we're going to have different modes. We need to make sure that data privacy is considered in that. So how these technologies talk with each other and how the handshakes, I think, is going to be really important for us as we move forward. So, and I also think, again, since with the complexity of the data we're going to be needing for technology leaders to give us innovation to how we can move away from such of that manual process, but also trust that our technologies are going to be able to provide us what we would traditionally maybe do and more of a manual process. So those are some of the things that I think, as we're looking at where we really need to go in industry and the evolution and the change between even the people, that the roles that we have, how we're going to be collecting data, I think is going to be important that we have key technology leaders and stakeholders that actually will be able to provide this innovation that we trust and we believe is going to also maintain the privacy that is going to be needed for all this different data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Katrina, I think that that's an excellent point. And again, I think really touches upon, some of the key points of the discussion earlier from your colleagues, Alethea and Aaron as well. So I think it's a really good point for consideration as we move forward. Alethea, let's move on to you in terms of how you feel the industry should sustain going forward and the role of technology in that.
Absolutely. To try to have some type of pragmatic approach, obviously, with all the disparate technology out there, There's a number of different organizations and part of the U.S. government that are working on a set of data standards moving forward. And many of those data standards, we should begin seeing the success of a variety of pilot studies that have been testing the whole notion of interoperability between EHR into EDC and then to the regulators. And so I feel as though we should be focusing on the less intervention of the human touch between a coordinator and then a clinical monitor and then a data scientist and then, to a statistician, the better, right? Because those are all cost drivers. When we're all touching the data at some point, we really need to reduce the risks of any transcription errors, but also more importantly, allow the technology to work as it already is. And so if I could just leave that final thought is I'm really excited about seeing some of the results of these pilot studies that are reducing the time to market, that are deploying the interoperability so that so few of us have to touch those data during a clinical trial.
Yeah, agree. And Erin, is there anything that you'd like to add on this?
No, I mean, I think I agree with everything that Althea and Katrina have both just shared, and I just see a huge role with moving forward with continuing, the strive for a unified platform that brings in a lot of different systems. I definitely think that's really important. And the only other thing I would add that I think, a lot of times everything's rushed, right? But I think, Katrina, you said it earlier, it's the data strategy up front, right? The build and working with your study team and what data needs to be collected and how you should collect it. And I would like to see more collaboration at the study build between the clinical operations and data management, just so both teams can understand why something was built the way it was or why certain data needs to be collected. I think if there's more collaboration up front, it will absolutely be better for everyone in the end and to understand why a system was built. And to Althea's point, once it's built, let the system and the data collection do its thing. So I think everyone shared some really valuable points.
There's kind of really this melting pot of a lot of considerations when we're thinking about not only our existing studies, but certainly our future studies, and how that's being set up not only from a strategy perspective, a technology perspective, keeping in mind, stakeholders, the process, the training that's involved. But I think the one thing that we've really heard here is in terms of benefiting from a, kind of this unified approach around our solutions, our technology, and our training, and kind of how that works together. So I really appreciate the inputs from our panelists, to Alethea, Erin, and Katrina. Let's move on to our Q&A portion. There's still time to submit your questions using the Q&A tab to the left of your screen. We do have lots of great questions already, so we're going to try to get to as many as possible. So let's go ahead and start off with our first one here. So the first question that we have here is kind of really focused around a validation report. If a sponsor outsourced a service such as IVR or TMF, what is a sponsor's responsibility regarding that validation report? Basically, an example of that is how deeply would the report be required to be verified by the sponsor? So Erin or Katrina, is this a question maybe from an operational perspective that you'd like to weigh in on?
Yes, I'll try to weigh in on that. So I actually think that the responsibility of the sponsor is to ensure that they have performed their due diligence and audited the provider that they're outsourcing to. So I think they're responsible to ensure that their policies, their procedures, their work instruction SOPs are in line, and that they can demonstrate that they have done the that they're executing and providing the services, whether it's just services or technology service, according to what is going to be needed in that sponsor. So I think at that point, I think the sponsor's responsibility is to ensure that they have audited that provider and that that provider does have the necessary components in place within their organization, that so that they feel comfortable and confident that they're handing their the services and the execution of their trial or system over to a provider that has demonstrated that. And I think the only way they can demonstrate that is that a sponsor is required to perform that audit and really have that audit certification, if you want to say a report that this vendor has provided that. So I think that's their overall responsibility, is to do that. And then the final thing is just, to ensure that ongoing that they, that the provider is demonstrating that they are working according to their procedures and things like that. So I think that's their responsibility. It's not a total hint, walk away, do it one time and walk away. But I think they're responsible to monitor that ongoing.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Another question that's come in is posed as such that several companies seem to offer platform solutions. In your opinion, what are some things to think about or ask when trying to differentiate them? So, Erin or Alethea, Katrina, yep. Anyone want to take this one?
This is Erin. Sorry, I was on mute, and I was on mute before too, and I was speaking. Katrina, I 100% agree with everything you said before. So on that previous answer, I 100% agree. When we were looking for uniform platforms, one of the things, being a small startup like we were, and we didn't have a lot of hands, is that we were really making sure that there was a lead for all the, systems that we were going to be bringing into the unified platform, and that there was going to be a lot of hand-holding, with the team and doing that. And also just seeing how they integrated with one another, the robustness, and also I'm feedback, talking to others and seeing what has worked for them and what hasn't worked for them. But I think the key is really making sure that there's secure knowledge and a strong lead for each of the different types of technologies you're looking to bring into your unified platform.
Great. Thank you, Erin. Okay, so another question we have come in is, as a data manager, I spend a lot of time integrating various data sources. It sounds like a platform approach would alleviate a lot of those issues. Can any of the panelists talk to having seen this in practice?
Yeah, I can. This is Katrina. I'll take that. So yes, this is clearly day to day from an operations perspective. We actually deal with that from a data management perspective. So one of the things that, again, when we're thinking about making sure your data strategy, you have technologies that support that, is that we utilized a technology that will, manage when all our external files are coming in. So we have definitely making sure you have a log, a key, actually having technologies that can help you program where you can program what we like to call as your smart listings. So you're able to program your reconciliation listings. And then as new data is coming in, those listings are run against, if you think about these standard listings or reconciliation methods that you want to have, and that the system is only allowing you to review things that have changed, newer changed data. So you're not re-reviewing everything over and over again. You're only reviewing things that have changed, and that you also have a system that allows you to have the ability to mark things that once they're reviewed, and again, no change, that you can, from maybe like an audit perspective, that you've actually looked at that data and reconciled it. So definitely from what we're seeing and what we faced with our own company is maximizing our own technology, our clinical data repository, to actually manage our external data, because as we talked about, the volume is so high now. So we had to look at how do we streamline that approach so that when new and changed data comes in, that's the only thing that you're reconciling, and then giving us the ability that when we need to query that data, that the queries are going to the appropriate, either the data provider, the external vendor, or if it's something that the site needs to do, so that we can have one that we're able to manage all that reconciliation within one platform.
Great. Katrina, I really appreciate the input there for that last question. I want to take the time now just to thank everybody for attending this Fierce Biotech webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd also like to thank our speakers, Alethea, Katrina, and Erin, for participating and for Medidata, as well as for presenting in today's webinar. Just as another friendly reminder, the webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier when you joined. So again, on behalf of Medidata, Alethea, Erin, and Katrina, we thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.